A high-level rim-protecting center out of Utah Valley just became available in the transfer portal. The Zags didn't land Fardaws Aimaq, but his successor, Aziz Bandaogo, is possibly an even better fit.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to give you daily reports through another offseason of Gonzaga hoops. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Happy May for everybody listening here on Monday, the first day of the month. So excited to be here in May as we this is the month where we're going to figure out what Gonzaga's roster is going to look like. The deadline for the NBA draft is May 31st. Some of the transfer portal stuff is going to kind of shake out this month. We may not have the roster fully done in May, but I think we're going to start to get some more closer pictures of what it's going to look like. Today's show, we're going to talk about the NCAA's inconsistent rules and how they implement the rules regarding double transfers, players who transfer and then want to transfer again. Sometimes they have to sit out a year. Seems like there's a lot of waivers. We're going to discuss that. We're going to discuss what that means for Efton Reid as he is in the transfer portal and would potentially have to sit out a year. We're going to discuss Dominic Harris's recruitment to close out the show. But we're leading today talking about a potentially huge, impactful transfer portal addition for the Zags in Aziz Bandaogo. This is just a continuation of our series looking at players in the transfer portal that may or may not be excellent fits at Gonzaga and what that might look like. Bandaogo is a 7-foot center from Senegal coming out of Utah Valley. Everyday listeners, and I mean everyday listeners, eagle-eyed ones, this name may sound familiar to you because I mentioned him as a potential addition for Gonzaga back in January. We did an episode looking way too far in advance at what next year's roster might look like. This was in January before, the transfer portal opened, obviously, before we knew who was going to stay, who was going to go. And I mentioned that assuming Drew Timme moves on, that a potential addition for the Zags to make at that time was Aziz Bandaogo. And here he is entering the transfer portal. He didn't enter right away. He entered very recently, in part. The coach at Utah Valley, Mark Madsen, took that head coach job at Cal. Part of the reason Fardaws Aimaq transferred from Texas Tech to Cal was to go back and play for his old head coach. Bandaogo obviously decided that he didn't want to stick around with the new assistant coach who took over as the head coach. He is now in the portal. He is ranked right now at Evan Miyakawa's website, which for all of you who listen to the show, who are everyday listeners, who are big college basketball people who want to know the ups and downs of what's going on in the transfer portal, highly, highly recommend subscribing to Evan Miyakawa's website. Is evanmiya.com. All sorts of fantastic scouting reports, ratings, transfer portal information for every single team in the NCAA. It is an extraordinary resource. Right now, as we're speaking, Bandaogo is the 69th ranked player in the portal, period, including players who have already committed to different spots. He is the 5th highest projected defender available in the transfer portal. So of all the players who are currently in the portal who are available, he is ranked as the 5th best defender going into next season. The only big man who is ahead of him is Moussa Cisse at Oklahoma State, or who was at Oklahoma State, who is obviously in the transfer portal. So Bandaogo is a potentially huge, impactful defensive player. He began his career at Akron and didn't really get off the ground there. He only played 7 games as a freshman. As a sophomore, he had a bigger role. He played 33 games. He only made 5 starts, only played about 12 minutes per game. So he was a role player for the Zips that year, 3 points, 3 boards. Transferred to Utah Valley ahead of last season and was an immediate replacement for Fardaws Aimaq, who, of course, transferred to Texas Tech last season, was in strong contention to come to Gonzaga. So we know Gonzaga has that pipeline, has at least had conversations with Utah Valley players in the past. And Bandaogo came in and was a tremendous replacement for Aimaq. I don't think Utah Valley fans could have imagined that they would get a player to come in and replace. I mean, Aimaq was like 19-14 in his final season at Utah Valley. Bandaogo didn't quite do that, but his numbers last year at Utah Valley, really, really good. He played 37 games, started every single one of them, played 30 minutes per night. He averaged 11.5 points per game, 10.5 rebounds per game, 2.9 blocks per game, as well as 1.2 assists per game. He was efficient around the rim, 61.6% on two-pointers. He was about 70% right around the rim. That's where 73% of his field goal attempts came as well. He is a low post scorer. He does not do much other than that. He did shoot 33% from deep. If you look at his basketball reference page, you're going to be like, oh, that looks pretty good. It was 5 of 15. So I don't think that we're going to count on the outside shooting being much of anything from Bandaogo going forward. That's more of a bonus than anything else, but not really a significant area of his game, evidenced by the fact that he shot 63.5% from the free throw line last year, which was a career high for him. Mind you, he is not a good free throw shooter, doesn't really extend the floor, but his impact is not on the offensive end of the floor. He's a rim runner. He could probably finish alley-oop dunks, could finish easy shots around the rim, et cetera, but he blocked 106 shots last year. That was third in the country. Third in the entire country. It broke the WAC record, all-time record for blocks in a single season in the Western Athletic Conference, now held by Aziz Bandaogo from his last season at Utah Valley. So this is the kind of impactful player that he could be. The offense, in Gonzaga's offense, probably going to do fine. Gonzaga obviously has run a lot of stuff through their low post threats in the past. He's not going to be as efficient of a scorer as a Drew Timme, which is nobody's going to be. We can just kind of get that out of the way now. He's probably not Anton Watson, not Graham Ike. Those guys would be more impactful on the offensive end of the floor, but his impact on defense would be tremendous. Now, in terms of who's interested, this is always kind of the intriguing part of this conversation is who, if Gonzaga were to pursue him, which as of right now, he just entered the portal. We haven't seen lists or anything like that emerge, so we don't know which schools have or have not reached out to him. But if Gonzaga does reach out, I'd be interested to see who they're going to compete with. I think there are some obvious potential suitors here. Cal makes sense. Why wouldn't Mark Madsen, if Madsen's the guy who got the most out of him last year? He did not show that kind of potential at Akron. He came to Utah Valley. He played under Coach Madsen, and immediately he blossomed into a tremendously impactful defensive player and a guy who averaged a double-double. Now, Madsen, of course, already recruited Aimaq to come back and play for him at Cal. Would Aimaq and Bandaogo play together in the front court? That is an intriguing question. I think potentially they could. I think Aimaq could play the 4. Bandaogo could play the 5. Are they interested in playing together? Is Madsen interested in bringing both those guys to the same place? All questions that they would need to sort out, that they would need to answer, but it's hard to not see that as at least one of the more obvious connections that could be made with Bandaogo right now. A couple other programs that I'm more just speculating are, hey, these are programs that need rim protection. They need a starting center, or at least a center who can come in, give them some size, give them some defense on that end of the floor. Arkansas has added basically every single guard that they possibly can in the transfer portal, but they are a little thin up front. This would be the kind of player that could really shore up that area of need for them. Duke, obviously Kyle Filipowski returning is huge for them, but they lose Derek Lively. He was their rim protector down low. Could they add a player like this to fill that role? Memphis loses DeAndre Williams. They certainly need some help up front. Oklahoma State, Musa Cisse, who I mentioned earlier, the best defender available in the portal in the front court, he's in the portal. And so Oklahoma State needs to replace that production there. San Diego State loses Keshad Johnson. He's a big loss for them. Adding a player like Bandaogo would be huge for them. Syracuse loses Jesse Edwards in the portal. We talked about him on a recent episode of Locked on Zags before he ultimately committed to West Virginia. But he was, I believe, the nation's leading shot blocker last year, or among the top shot blockers last year. And then Texas Tech. Guess what? They lost Aimaq. Perhaps the trend will continue, and Aimaq will move on, and Texas Tech will take another center from Utah Valley in Aziz Bandaogo. Definitely a potential landing spot that makes some sense for him there as well. Now, the big thing with Bandaogo right now is the potential for him to have to sit out a year, because he transferred from Akron to Utah Valley during the transfer portal era and did not have to sit out a year. Now he enters the portal again out of Utah Valley, and he's not a graduate transfer, so he does not get the ability to transfer right away without a waiver. We're going to talk a lot more about the waiver process in the second segment of the show, but it's an interesting dynamic for Gonzaga, because if he does not feel like he's going to get a waiver, and his coach leaving usually grants players a waiver. Some people may disagree with this. Again, we'll talk about it more, but I think it's fairly likely that Bandaogo is going to be able to get a waiver to go somewhere else, because his head coach left, and when he committed to Utah Valley, he committed to play for Coach Madsen. Coach Madsen's not there. Generally, the NCAA grants that. If the NCAA is not going to grant that, I almost think that this gives Gonzaga a better chance of landing Bandaogo because they have such a rich history of developing players for a year to sit out. I mean, just point at Brandon Clark. That's what they would do. Brandon Clark came from a somewhat similar program, San Jose State versus Utah Valley. Utah Valley is a better program. Don't get it twisted, but a mid-major school on the West Coast. Brandon Clark put up big numbers there and then came to Gonzaga and exploded. If I'm Gonzaga and I know that Bandaogo has to sit out a year, that's what I'm selling that. I'm selling Kyle Wiltshire. I'm selling Jonathan Williams. All of those players who have come. I mean, you could sell the Kelly Olynyk story as well, even though he didn't actually transfer. So I think that would almost give Gonzaga an advantage. They say, hey, come here. You sit out a year, go against Anton Watson, Graham, Ike in practice. Next year, Watson's out the door. Even if Ike and Greg are back, you step into a bigger role. So I don't think that the NCAA is going to force him to sit out a year. I don't think that they should. Again, we'll get to that. But I do think that actually gives Gonzaga an advantage. Even if not, even if he is going to play right away, this would be a wonderful addition for Gonzaga. Bandaogo, Ike, Watson, Greg, in whatever order, those four guys, that is a elite back front court. Somebody in that is not going to play enough minutes, which is always unfortunate. I don't know who it would be. I think it might be Ike, which seems a little bit surprising, but the way Greg played and the fact that he can stretch the floor just makes him so valuable. Watson's for sure going to play a lot of minutes. And I think Bandaogo, I don't think he'd come in and play 30, but I think if he were to play right away, he would come in and play an impactful role for the Zags right away. So it's an interesting dynamic to see what that might look like for the Zags if they were to add him. But it's also possible he'd have to sit out a year. And if the Zags could add him that way and have him sit for a year, develop and get better, and then play next year, oh boy, I think that could be tremendous for the Bulldogs. Well, the NCAA's inconsistency regarding the double transfer it's not only frustrating for a player like Bandaogo right now, it's frustrating for a guy like Efton Reid, who is dealing with this tough situation as he looks for his next school. We're going to talk more about that after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. Grand slams, no-hitters, and double plays are back, and there is no better place to get in on the MLB action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now, new customers can step up to the plate with a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon, sign up, place your first bet, and get up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if you don't win. Maybe you Zag fans want to bet on Marco Gonzalez to get a win for the Mariners, or perhaps Eli Morgan to snag a save for the Guardians. Don't miss your chance right now to get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags. I want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen every day. For you everyday listeners, tomorrow on the show, we're going to continue our season in review series. We're going to continue to look at players who were on the team last year, what their potential or what their future looks like, whether they're going to stay at Gonzaga, what their role might be next year. We're also going to continue, of course, our transfer portal series, looking at players that the Zags could add as long as the portal remains open and the Zags still have some scholarships to fill. We're going to continue to do that throughout the offseason. So stick with us here, Locked On Zags. Again, available on wherever you get podcasts and on YouTube as well if you have not checked out the show there. All right, I want to kind of talk about the two remaining Zags in the transfer portal, former Zags who are in the transfer portal. Of course, we talked last week about Hunter Sallis joining Wake Forest, Steve Forbes, and the Demon Deacons and what that means for him. So we're going to close out the show, talk about Efton Reid here in the second segment and Dominic Harris in the final segment. And we're going to keep talking about Wake Forest because the recent report that we have heard is that Efton Reid, who most people believed was pretty much a lock to go to VCU, is in fact visiting Wake Forest. He is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. As I'm speaking, maybe not as you're listening, but the report that I got is he went over there over the weekend. He was hanging out with Hunter Sallis. He was on campus with Wake Forest. It was an official visit, checking out the campus. And the biggest question that everybody has right now is whether Efton Reid would get a waiver to play at Wake Forest. I don't think there's much debate that Reid would probably rather play at Wake Forest than VCU. And that's not a knock on VCU. Wake Forest, obviously an ACC program, Power 5, plays against Duke, North Carolina, etc. VCU is an extraordinary mid-major program. They lost their head coach. They've rebuilt well in the transfer portal this season. So be interested to see kind of how that all shakes out. But the main thing for Reid right now, the reason that VCU was miles ahead, was kind of the obvious landing spot for him, is because he's from Richmond, Virginia. And so transferring back home where VCU is, or very close to where VCU is, that waiver was basically automatic. basically automatic. There was no way that Efton Reid wouldn't be able to play right away if he transfers to VCU. A waiver to Wake Forest is less likely because it is not as close to his hometown. It's like 3 hours away from his hometown. So he would have to cite different reasoning on his paperwork for why he's transferring, like what he's claiming is the issue in order to get a waiver in order to play right away at Wake Forest. This is a dumb system. There's no other way to look. This is a dumb system. And I think a lot of you probably disagree with what I'm about to say because I think the solution is maybe different than you do. But I think we can all agree that having it be there's a rule, but you can apply for a waiver and the NCAA gets complete jurisdiction over whether they're going to give you a waiver. And there's not really any clarity as to what exactly is going to get you a waiver. Sometimes a player seems like they should get a waiver and they don't. Sometimes a player gets a waiver when you're not sure. I think we can all agree that that system is bad. It's not working. It's inconsistent. These poor players are in the portal not knowing whether they're going to have to sit out a year, whether they're going to be able to play right away, whether they can pick a school that they want to go to or not. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. If the NCAA determined that it's okay for Efton Reid to play at VCU next year because that's close to home, and they say, no, you can't play at Wake Forest next year, you have to sit out a year, that just doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to me. Are they going to take out a map and measure exactly how far it is? Everywhere from Spokane is closer to home for Efton Reid than, everywhere, unless you went to UW or Hawaii, like everywhere is basically going to be closer to home. It just doesn't make sense. For me, the NCAA just needs to make a rule and stick with it. I think we can all agree there. For me, I don't think these players should be penalized for wanting to transfer again. I don't. And I get that there's some people who think, well, we shouldn't just let these guys willy-nilly move from school to school to school every single year. But why not? We'll talk a little bit about one of the issues with that, and that's NIL related, but it's not necessarily transfer portal related. I understand that there's going to be disagreement on this, and I get it. And I don't think that there's going to be a lot of mind changing on either direction necessarily. But to me, college is not about like you pick a place and you have to be there for 4 years. I just don't think that that's what it's about. And situations change. They change. Yes, sometimes players make mistakes. They pick a place, they shouldn't have picked that place. They transfer. The place they picked a second time also wasn't a good fit for them, and they transfer again. And that's frustrating. And I admit fans roll their eyes like, well, why did he do that? Blah, blah, blah. I get it. But I don't understand. The argument that people make is that players should be forced to stay somewhere they don't want to be. And that to me is what I just do not understand. If you do not want to be somewhere, if you do not want to play somewhere, you should not be forced to stay there or else not play at all for an entire year. I do not think that that is fair. And I don't really understand compelling arguments for why it should be. And I want to be clear about, because we're using Efton Reid as the example because he is a relevant player in this conversation. So is Bandaogo, for the record. But Efton Reid is not a cancer. He is not a toxic player. In fact, he was very well loved from what I have heard. He is a great kid, a great young man, a positive energy. So I don't want to imply anything negative about Efton Reid specifically. Having said that, if Efton Reid doesn't want to play at Gonzaga next year, why should we make him play at Gonzaga next year or sit out a year? Why are those the only two options? It doesn't make sense to me. Gonzaga can, if Efton Reid doesn't want to play here next year, for whatever reason, whatever the reason is, maybe he just realized the offense isn't for him. We saw him play last year, and I think he would have figured it out with more playing time, but he got beat out by another player in Ben Gregg, who's back next year. If I'm Efton Reid and I see, well, Ben Gregg, he passed me on the depth chart. Anton Watson's ahead of me at the depth chart. They add this EK guy. I don't want to be a fourth big again. So I'm going to go transfer somewhere else where I can play. Maybe he didn't feel comfortable with the offense. Maybe he didn't feel comfortable with the coaching staff. Maybe he doesn't like Spokane. Maybe it's a combination of all of those things. Maybe he truly is homesick. Who knows? But if he doesn't want to be here, why should he have to be here? Nothing that people can say can really convince me to not believe that. Because I don't think Efton Reid would come back and sulk and moan and cry and cause all sorts of problems. I really don't. But I don't think he should have to be here. Go get somebody like Bandaogo. If he wants to be here, get a player who's more comfortable being here, who's more excited about the situation than a player who feels like, well, I can't go anywhere because I'm not allowed to transfer without sitting out. So I guess I'm just going to come back to Gonzaga. Why would we want that? Again, I'm not trying to trash Reid as a person. I promise you I'm not. I'm just using him as an example. But for any team, why would you want a player to come back to your team who doesn't want to be there? Let him go somewhere else. Let them go transfer somewhere else, find a spot that's better for them, because for a school like Gonzaga, they'll just replace you. They'll find somebody else. It doesn't feel like the system is that. People love to cite there's 1,800, 2,000 people in the portal, and people like to kind of panic about it. But I don't really, at the end of the year, every single team's going to have the same number of players. Some teams are going to get worse, some teams are going to get better, and that's just kind of part of how it works. You as a coach have to figure out, how can I put the pieces together as best as possible? And yeah, it is frustrating when players transfer. It is frustrating to have lost 3 players who could have had significant roles on this team next year. It is. We felt it. Every single one of you felt it when Hunter Sallis entered the portal, Dominic Harris, Efton Reid. It was hard. But I don't want those guys here if they don't want to play for this team, if they don't want to play in this school, if they don't want to play in this city, like whatever it may be, for whatever reason. If they don't want to be here, I don't feel like they should have to stay. Having said all of that, one area that does need to be addressed with regards to a potential reality in the future where players are, we're already in that future where there's basically no rules on transferring, but even if the double transfers weren't penalized, NIL needs to be regulated more. Because if you enter the transfer portal with the sole purpose of, I'm just entering for the highest bidder, that I think needs to be changed. And I struggle with this because I don't think players should be capped on how much money they can make. But I think there needs to be a way for this to be regulated so that we don't see just like every player entering the portal just to get paid more, because that's going to really, really cause issues for smaller budget schools. And I want the playing field to be a little bit more even, whether that's every school getting a certain budget, which I don't think works. I'm not sure how that would necessarily exist. And also, would those rules continue to be followed? No, probably not. So you just create more issues there. Whether it's that specific dollar amounts can't be discussed until you actually sign with a new school. Again, that rule would just get broken and the NCAA can't really enforce that. So I don't have an answer. I wish that I did. If I did, I would hope the NCAA would be paying me a lot of money to implement said answer. So I don't know what it is. But I do think that restricting players from being able to transfer and keeping them at schools that they don't want to be at doesn't seem like it's a good solution for the players. It doesn't seem like it's a good solution for the coaches. It doesn't seem like it's a good solution for the teammates. It doesn't seem like it's a good solution to the fans. And yet so many people are like, well, I don't think Reid should be able to transfer. I don't think Bandaogo should be able to, I don't understand that. You can let me know why you disagree. If there's a point that you think that I missed here, I'm happy to hear it. I'm happy to entertain it. But to me, players being forced to stay places they don't want to be will just never, ever make sense to me. All right, Dominic Harris, taking a visit to BYU of all places. We're going to discuss his visit to BYU, his potential fit with the Cougars if he were to end up there, and another Power 5 program that there is a strong connection to right now for Mr. Harris. All that coming up right after this. All right, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still locked on Zags. We're still talking Zags and the NCAA transfer portal. We talked about Aziz Bandaogo as a potential fit for Gonzaga at the center position. We talked about Efton Reid, who he would be replacing as he has entered the transfer portal, is now down to either Wake Forest or VCU as his next destination. We're going to close out the show, talked about Dominic Harris, the first Zag to enter the transfer portal. And honestly, since Dom entered the portal, it's been kind of radio silence. I've checked in with some sources. I've talked to some people, and there's not a lot out there on Dom right now. There's a family, they're playing it pretty close to the chest, and I think they're just kind of feeling out all their options. And why wouldn't you? For Dom, like, he doesn't have a lot of tape. I think it's there's a lot more that goes into recruiting a player like Dom, who was a highly regarded recruit, and there's, by all accounts, is a talented basketball player and is more talented than the numbers would indicate at Gonzaga. So, and then there's some health questions with him as well. So he's a bit more of a tricky transfer portal situation. But obviously, the fact that BYU is interested proves that, he's not necessarily going to have to go down a level. BYU is, as by next season, a Power 5 program. BYU is a Big 12 program. If Dominic Harris ends up in the Big 12, that's proof that teams are willing to give him an opportunity, even after playing a limited role at Gonzaga the last couple of years. For BYU, I can see the fit, although I don't know exactly how big of a role Dom could, in theory, carve out there. They lose their first and third leading scorers from last year. Rudy Williams out the door, one and done guy for them. He was a graduate transfer, only had 1 year of eligibility. He was their leading scorer last year. Gideon George, who it felt like was at BYU for a really, really long time, he is now out the door. He was their third leading scorer. He's more of a wing, but Rudy Williams was a guard. So they are losing a legitimate guard in Rudy Williams. But they returned Jackson Robinson. They returned Spencer Johnson. They returned point guard Dallin Hall. And they returned Richie Saunders. That's 4 guards right there who, in theory, should all have roles. I think the only I think the least minutes that any of those guys played last year was Richie Saunders, and he played like 15 minutes per game. So all four of those guys were rotation players last season. Does that mean Dom wouldn't be able to beat any of them out? Absolutely not. Dom probably would beat some of those guys out. I don't think he beats out Dallin Hall and Spencer Johnson. So I think that he's maybe your third guard, plays a big role off the bench. That's just what I'm envisioning. But I don't know. Dom could come in there and knock some of those guys out and potentially be a guy who starts or plays 25 minutes per game on that team. I'm a little questionable on whether he would actually do that, but he gives them a different dynamic. He fills the Rudy Williams kind of void a little bit more. He's a good outside shooter. He's a very athletic guard. I think BYU, Mark Pope would give him opportunities to be their lead guard, play point guard. Their leading assist guy last year was Dallin Hall. He was about 3 assists per game and about 20 minutes a game. So if Hall's playing time bumps up, I think he's probably their true point guard. But you could have Harris be backup point guard and also play an off the ball role. I think there's a fit here. I think there's a reason it worked. It's weird for Gonzaga to see another player go to BYU. Of course, they have had that happen before with Jesse Wade. Jesse Wade was a member of the Latter-day Saints Church, and so that kind of made that connection a little bit more obvious. But I could see this working out. I could really see Dom ending up at BYU. And up to this point, it's really the only school that has publicly been reported that there's interest. And Dom has not taken a visit yet, but it is reported that he is going to visit BYU. If that's the only visit he's taking, there's a pretty good chance that ends up being a commitment and that Dom ends up playing for the Cougars. Right now, they are in the lead for his services for next season. But there's another school that I think is worth at least mentioning here, and it's also worth mentioning because it's news related to the Gonzaga women's basketball program, which is Michaela Williams, who we talked about last Tuesday. For you everyday listeners on Locked On Zags, we talked about the women's basketball's portal movement so far this season. They made one addition from Utah. They had one player out the door, and that was Michaela Williams. Michaela Williams, who averaged 7.7 points per game last year for the Zags, 3.9 boards, 2.5 assists. She started 33 games and played 31 minutes. So she was a big-time player for Gonzaga last year. It was her third year with the Zags, first year as a full-time starter. Well, she transferred to Cal. She is joining the Golden Bears program, Power 5. Not only Power 5, but the Pac-12 is one of the best women's basketball conferences in the entire country, if not the best, top to bottom. There's so much depth in the Pac-12, so a really, really nice spot for Michaela Williams to end up. I bring this all up because Michaela Williams and Dominic Harris have been in a relationship for a long time. I'm not going to pretend that I have a ton of details about this other than following them on Instagram and on social media, which only tells you part of the story, but they have been close for a long time. They both entered the portal at the same time. There's speculation that they could end up in the same destination next year. Cal is a place that makes sense. There has not been any reported connection between Dominic Harris and Cal other than his girlfriend going to Cal. That is the only connection that is there, and it is flimsy. And I want to be clear, I'm not just making some wild assumption that they're going to play together next year. But here's the thing. Cal has lost 9 players to the transfer portal. 9. Because they were horrendous last year. And they replaced their coach. And new coach Madsen probably came in and pushed some of those guys out the door because it is not a good program last year. One of the worst Power 5 men's basketball programs ever. That's how bad Cal was last year. Cal loses 9 players to the transfer portal. They've replaced 2 of them. Fardaws Aimaq, who we talked about extensively in the first segment, being the Utah Valley big man who Bandaogo replaced, who, of course, was connected to Gonzaga for a while. He goes to go play for his old coach, Mark Madsen, at Cal. The other addition for them is Jalen Cone, who is a point guard, a true point guard, coming over from Northern Arizona, another player that I thought the Zags were going to give some interest to. Perhaps they did, but he ends up going over to Cal. That means, in theory, they have 7 potential spots to replace. Now, they have some freshmen coming in next year in their recruiting class, but they have multiple spots that still need to be filled. It seems like Dom could potentially be an option there. If this seems more like a Cal would probably take Dom, but does Dom want to go to Cal situation? As in, like, I don't think the issue is Dom wants to go play at Cal. He wants to go be reunited with Michaela Williams, but Cal's like, oh, no, thanks. That would surprise me. Mark Madsen, I don't know that he can be that picky. And I think Dominic Harris is the kind of player that is looking for a fresh start, is looking for an opportunity, and a team that has basically an entirely new roster. That seems like a really good fit. Now for Cal, not only is Jalen Cone coming in, a guy who's going to play 30 plus minutes per night and probably be their starting guard and a high level scorer, maybe their leading scorer. They also return Devin Askew. Devin Askew began his career at Kentucky, played 1 year at Texas, transferred again, and played at Cal last year. He had suffered an injury early in the season, which kept him out of a lot of action. But when he did play, he scored 15.5 points per game. He is also a guard. So Jalen Cone and Devin Askew are probably two of the three best players on Cal's roster right now, along with Aimaq. Both those guys are undersized guards. So it's a bit of an issue for Dom in the sense that I don't know that they start Cone, Askew, and Harris all together. So one of those guys probably comes off the bench. But Dom could be like a high-level scorer off the bench for them. He could absolutely fill that role. I wouldn't be surprised if Dom at least considers this, again, knowing absolutely nothing about his current relationship status other than what I see on social media. It makes some sense. It is a return to his home state in California. Dom is from south of LA and Cal is in Berkeley, so they are not very close to each other. It's not really, I mean, it's closer than Spokane, but it's still like a flight away. So he's not really like moving home. He's just moving closer to home if he were to go to Cal. But I think this is a really good fit for him. I think it's a fun opportunity for him to go to a team that has a lot of wide openness. I think Mark Madsen's a very, very good coach, and I think he would do a really good job with Dom. I think if Dom bought into the system, got a chance to play with Askew and Cone, I think he could carve out a really big role and be a big-time contributor for the Golden Bears as they kind of try to rebuild this team after what has just been an absolute mess the last few years under Coach Mark Fox. So something to keep an eye on with Dom, and potential to keep an eye on with Efton Reid at Wake Forest as well, as we kind of get a glimpse of where our former Zags are going to end up this portal season. All right, that's going to do it for me today. Plenty more content coming your way this week. We're going to continue our season in review series. We're going to keep looking at transfer portal additions the Zags may or may not make. We're going to keep you posted on the Zags remaining in the NBA playoffs, and of course, the Zags baseball team as well. All sorts of fantastic stuff coming your way this week. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on YouTube if you have not done so yet. Just go to youtube.com, search Locked On Zags, hit that big red subscribe button. You can also leave a review on iTunes. You can follow me on Twitter, Andy Patton CBB. You can find the show on Twitter at Locked On Zags as well. And also check out the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. It is a daily national college hoop show brought to you by myself and my co-host Isaac Shade of Locked On Tar Heels. Very, very fun show, talking all things going around the entire landscape of college basketball. All right, thank you all for listening. And as always, go Zags.